Chapter 21 covers Roosevelt's New Deal. So we discussed the Roaring Twenties, we discussed what caused the onset of the Great Depression, the worsening of a downturn into a full-blown depression. Now the discussion needs to be, what did the United States do to address the Great Depression? Obviously, with the negative view of Herbert Hoover that we discussed in our last lecture, Governor of New York, Franklin Roosevelt, wins the presidential election of 1932 in an absolute landslide. Herbert Hoover stood no chance. You probably could have run somebody who had no name recognition whatsoever, let alone Franklin Roosevelt was a cousin of a former president. You probably could have run anyone and defeated Hoover. Roosevelt, who actually had some name recognition, as well as some specific policies that he was promoting to help recover from the Depression, which he referred to as a New Deal for the American people. This made him popular on top of Hoover's unpopularity. FDR referred to his presidential cabinet as the Brain Trust, and the Brain Trust came up with a three-pronged plan to address the Great Depression. First, they wanted relief. They needed direct aid to the poor and unemployed. Then they needed to recover. So first you need to provide relief to the immediate crisis. Then you need to recover and get back to a sense of a normal functioning economy. And then you need to reform, which is to change the economic system to correct mistakes that had caused the Great Depression. This is probably the most controversial because there are different views of what caused the Depression and how it needed to be addressed. And so some of the reforms are actually criticized by some economists. So the first goal being relief. What was done? Well, things like the bank holiday and the Emergency Banking Act is what created this bank holiday and allowed banks to reopen securely. Then you had the Public Works Administration. This is a massive expansion in federal spending, way beyond anything that Herbert Hoover was doing, and it puts tens of thousands of people back to work. You have the Civilian Conservation Corps. These are environmental projects like flood control, soil conservation, etc. And then also public park construction. If you've ever been camping at a New York State Department of Environmental Conservation campground, a lot of the work that was done on those was done during the Great Depression. And then you have the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. This is federal funds dedicated to paying people to do even the simplest of work like raking leaves in a local park. Excuse me. Some of these programs led to a lot of new infrastructure, such as schools being built. And Grimshaw Elementary here in Lafayette Central Schools was built during the Great Depression. So, second goal, recovery. Let's recover the economy from the crisis. We've provided relief to the people to help get them through. Now we need to recover the economy itself. So you have the National Recovery Administration that would focus on getting businesses back open. The funding that came to those businesses, though, had attachments, strings attached. And businesses had to agree to certain maximum hours of work, a minimum wage, production quota, etc. They had to agree to a lot of those things before they could receive this NRA funding. And this gives workers more rights in this system. Mortgage relief, the creation of the Federal Housing Administration, helped homeowners refinance at lower fixed interest rates at longer intervals to make the loans much more affordable. People lost their homes at much lower rates after this. And some of these policies actually still exist today. As a matter of fact, Mrs. Baker and I, our very first mortgage was an FHA mortgage. It meant that we did not have the kind of money on hand to purchase a home without it being insured by the federal government via the FHA. And you just pay a small insurance fee on that loan, which in turn helps fund the FHA mortgage program. And so a lot of folks that wouldn't be able to afford a home otherwise can buy one, and those that were in loans that they were having trouble paying back could refinance and make it more affordable to them. You could see here a cartoon on the left called The Spirit of the New Deal, which is a 1933 cartoon in the Washington Star, a newspaper. And this depicts the NRA promoting peace between workers and employers. So you have Uncle Sam in the center with his arms around both the employer as well as the employee. And this is a show that we can get support from both worker and owner of business in order to make this work. More on recovery efforts. Excuse me. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, this is a pretty controversial piece. It actually gets overturned by the Supreme Court for being an improper interference in the economy by the government. This actually, it pays farmers to take land out of production and or to destroy a portion of their crops or livestock to stabilize prices. And farm subsidies continue even today after this. The movie Food Inc. actually addresses the problem associated with modern farm subsidies as well as modern food production and how it's not entirely healthy for people. So one of the side effects to the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which after it was overturned by the Supreme Court, a newer version was created and it was not overturned by the court. Issues from back then and today that exist, corporate farms. You remember the discussion of bonanza farms. Well, corporate farms are like bonanza farms on steroids. They are absolutely gigantic. And little guy farmers have trouble keeping up with that kind of production that a corporate farm can do. So here's a graphic showing you part of the issue with farm subsidies and therefore too much money going to the big corporate farms. So of all subsidy payments, 80% of farmers, so most of the little guys, I guess you would call them, 80% of farmers only receive 17% of all subsidy payments. The lower you get as far as this graphic gets, so the top 1% of the top 5%, so less than 1%, get 22% of subsidy payments. That is craziness. Huge corporate farms do not need that kind of support from the federal government. So the system does not work out for the little guy, but rather for the big corporate farms. And that's true of the Great Depression and even today. You could see a picture here of sharecroppers that had been evicted from their farms trying to move west for better opportunities. So here they are leaving New Madrid County, Missouri, as a result of these government subsidies making it so that sharecroppers took a whole bunch of land out of production, or actually I should say the landowners took the land out of production, which took the sharecroppers and made them unemployed. They couldn't even continue to stay where they were because they weren't going to be able to fulfill a sharecropping contract under those conditions. So when people reduced their production on their land, sharecroppers were one of the groups that suffered from that decision. The third goal of reform: what are you going to do to change the system so that something like the Great Depression would never happen again? Things like the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, known just by the acronym FDIC, provide federally backed insurance to banks. That meant that if customers were going to put their money in a bank, they could be reassured that even if that bank went completely bankrupt, that the federal government backed that person's money. And if you read the fine print when you open a bank account, it'll say things like, your deposits here are guaranteed by the FDIC up to and including $250,000, which the average American is never going to accumulate that kind of savings. So essentially, all of your money is guaranteed. Now, the stock market. Changes to the stock market through the Securities and Exchange Commission, again, just known as the SEC. This regulated pricing and trading practices. And one of the main goals is to prevent margin buying, which we mentioned before, and stock speculation, quick buying and selling of stocks just to maximize a quick profit. And then you also have Social Security, the Social Security Act of 1935. So this provides like retirement funds, retirement money to the elderly. And this was paid for by a combined tax on businesses and their employees. So a business pays about half of the cost, the employee pays about half of the cost, and in the end of someone's working life, when they draw on Social Security in their retirement years, that money that they receive is paid for by these taxes on businesses and employees. This is seen sometimes as an unsustainable system because when the baby boom generation was paying into this system, the system was very solvent, which meant that there were no worries about the system running out of money. Well, now the baby boomers are drawing on this system, and there are fewer workers replenishing the system with new taxes. So there are fears that the Social Security system is doomed to go bankrupt. Another goal of reforming was to create lasting impacts from getting people back to work. And one of the best possible examples of this is the Tennessee Valley Authority, better known by its acronym of just the TVA. And this addressed multiple things all at once. First of all, it gave jobs to people in the Tennessee Valley region that were in abject poverty. They are very desperately poor. So not only does it get them back to work and earning a paycheck, but it also provides them with things like running water, electricity, and fair prices for that electricity, as well as, when the agriculture side of things is considered, flooding conditions were kept under control by these dams as well. So you've heard the term killing two birds with one stone. Well, the creation of the TVA was killing like 4 or 5 birds with one stone. And probably one of the most popular and the most famous of the New Deal programs. You can see a map here mapping out dams, power plants all over the Tennessee Valley region, which was not, you picture the Tennessee River Valley and you picture just the state of Tennessee. Well, you can see in this graphic, this map, that there are many, many, many states with TVA dams and power plants. Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, of course, up into parts of Missouri. This is very, very significant in lifting people who lived in this region out of poverty and putting them on a long-term track for success, because these dams and power plants were not going to be something that was temporary. They would be there forever. A similar project, the Columbia River Project, lesser known, but this in the Northwest, impacting places like Washington, Oregon, parts of Montana, Idaho. This was a lesser known project, but nonetheless had a similar effect on the Northwest. Also, the Wagner Act. So we mentioned before the NRA funding was dependent on giving people a chance to negotiate for better hours, better wages, etc. Negotiating for those things is actually known as collective bargaining. So the NRA got that started. By 1935, the Wagner Act gave workers collective bargaining rights for all time. Eventually, the NRA would stop giving funds, and therefore the requirements for those funds would also disappear. The National Labor Relations Act, which really just became nicknamed the Wagner Act, created a board to oversee that this collective bargaining negotiating going on between employers and their employees was happening fairly. Also in 1938, this was followed up by the Fair Labor Standards Act. And this was to set minimum wage, maximum hours, and this really, really stabilized the labor force. People felt confident that they would be treated fairly in the workplace, and even if they did have to work overtime, longer than the maximum hours and minimum wage, that they would be given time and a half for their efforts. And also, child labor laws. We talked in the Industrial Revolution up through this time period, the problem of child labor in factories. The Fair Labor Standards Act addressed that as well. Now, despite all these efforts, there are still things that made the Depression hard to combat. The Dust Bowl, which you can see a map here that I drew directly from the textbook, that made people in this region of northwest Texas, parts of New Mexico, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, this whole region of the country was devastated by the Dust Bowl. The famous novel, The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, also turned into a Hollywood film starring Henry Fonda. This is absolutely devastating. And the horrible part about this is that these conditions happened at the same time as a global economic crisis. So, despite the fact that there were lots of New Deal efforts trying to help folks, the Dust Bowl devastated many nonetheless. In 1936, FDR is widely seen as doing a great job trying to help recover from the Depression. So he wins re-election in 1936 in an absolute landslide. And after winning this re-election landslide, FDR gets a little big for his britches, I guess you could say, using that slang term, because constitutional issues begin to pop up rather quickly during that presidential campaign and certainly afterwards. In 1935, the Supreme Court had ruled that the NRA was unconstitutional, portions of it, not the entire agency. In 1936, the Agricultural Adjustment Act is declared unconstitutional. As I mentioned before with the AAA, similar legislation was not overturned in 1938. Nonetheless, FDR has Congress in a headlock in this political cartoon, but he's now reaching out to the Supreme Court because he really needs the Supreme Court to cooperate and stop overturning some of his decisions. You could see here, too, the Illegal Act, a cartoon critical of the Supreme Court's decision declaring the NRA unconstitutional, or portions of the NRA unconstitutional. And so this is showing a view that the Supreme Court had made a mistake by declaring some things unconstitutional. And the caption, "I'm sorry, but the Supreme Court says I must chuck you back in." So here's the average American represented by Uncle Sam here. And the boat, which is labeled National Recovery, FDR is forced to throw Uncle Sam back out into the ocean that is labeled the Depression because the Supreme Court named pieces of the NRA unconstitutional. So this cartoon, very, very critical of the Supreme Court. Well, there's two sides to everything, because here are some political cartoons that were in response to a 1937 proposal by FDR to add justices to the Supreme Court, expanding it from 9 judges to 15. Key piece of this: he would himself appoint all of these new justices. This plan was defeated in Congress. Here is one political cartoon titled Step by Step, in which FDR, labeled here, has already achieved government reorganization via his many of his New Deal proposals. If we allow him the next step of a Supreme Court update with 6 new justices, all appointed by him, he will rise to the level of a dictator. Now, this might be a bit extreme. This might be propaganda, but nonetheless it showed that some reaction to his court packing proposal was quite negative. You can see another cartoon here published in the Richmond Times-Dispatch newspaper in 1937 that the legislature and the presidency are in lockstep, meaning they are marching to the tune of the same drummer, the New Deal. And they need the Supreme Court to fall in line. A lot of really good political cartoons come out of the Depression era, because whenever something sweeping like the New Deal is going to take place, there is going to be pushback against it. There's going to be support for it. And obviously that's where a lot of these really good political cartoons come from. Now, liberalism is popularized during the Depression. Now, first we have to define what we mean by liberalism. Okay? Once upon a time, to be a liberal, so in the colonial period, in the Revolutionary period, the Declaration of Independence, to be a liberal meant that you believed in republicanism, meaning a republic like we have in the United States. This is when people were living under monarchies. Liberalism by this time period is redefined. It is something very different. Liberals in this period supported the New Deal as a program that saved democracy and the free market system from collapse. FDR is becoming more and more popular because of these liberal programs, and particularly through his fireside chats on the radio, in which average Americans felt as though their president was speaking directly to them. FDR's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was also very actively involved in New Deal efforts with her husband, and was thought to be representative of the new woman that was much more actively involved in society. Remember, this is less than a generation removed from women gaining the right to vote. FDR had the first female cabinet member, multiple African American members of the cabinet. So changing definition of what it means to be liberal, and also showing that FDR's liberal programs were quite popular with the American people. So here is FDR in front of all of the major broadcasts of the period. Just a really good depiction of his use of the media to speak to the American people as directly as possible. Here's a 1935 cartoon by William Gropper portraying Uncle Sam as Gulliver. And he's tied down, and this is compared to the 18th century novel Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. And in this case, the bonds, what is keeping him down, are the numerous agencies and laws created by the New Deal. So what Gropper is suggesting in this political cartoon is that these things are actually inhibiting the country from getting back on its feet rather than helping. Again, another great example of the controversy of all these major initiatives. Famous story from the Great Depression. Marian Anderson, very famous opera singer from this time period. She was scheduled to sing at an opera house in Washington, and that performance was canceled when they found out that she was a black woman, because the segregated opera house did not want her performing. Eleanor Roosevelt and her husband, President of the United States, move her performance to an outdoor performance. And this outdoor performance, no mistake, is in front of the Lincoln Memorial. We will come back to this in the future when we discuss the civil rights movement and leaders like Martin Luther King. But Marian Anderson performs beautifully. And as you can see, all these microphones are broadcasting the singing to the American people. And this is only a gesture. It isn't near the achievements that were made a generation later in the civil rights movement. But nonetheless, even this symbolic moment shows that the nation is starting to believe much more strongly in equality under the law and the equal rights of all American citizens. FDR runs and is elected to a third term in 1940, and then a fourth term in 1944 in the midst of World War II. This is extremely controversial. Every single president since George Washington had adhered to an unwritten rule of a two-term limit. Some presidents had only served one, in fact. The 22nd Amendment is added to the Constitution in 1951 to prevent any presidents from serving more than 2 terms. Why do I mention this in this presentation? Well, it's important to note that FDR was wildly popular for his New Deal programs and also for his leadership during World War II. But his initial popularity with the American people was his New Deal programs. Lastly, before we can wrap up, what truly brings us out of the Depression? If you look at unemployment figures, unemployment remains stubbornly high, above 15%, until right around the window of time that Europe begins fighting World War II. And even though the United States would not join World War II until December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, we're going to get to this. In that window of time, you can see that with the United States providing aid to Britain, France, fighting of the Nazis, there's a drastic decrease in unemployment. And it is really World War II and not the New Deal that brings the United States permanently out of the Depression. The New Deal was really more about providing that relief to people who were suffering so badly. That's the end of the lecture. If you have any questions, please reach out. Otherwise, I will see you in class.